Okay, let's dive in. When you think about poverty in America, what usually comes to mind first?
Right. Maybe individual choices, skills,
Yeah.
or maybe just bad luck.
Exactly. That's the kind of common picture, isn't it? But when we started digging into this stack of sources, you shared all the research, the analysis we found, well, frankly, a much deeper and more unsettling story.
That's right. And our mission in this deep dive is really to cut through those maybe easy answers.
Mhm.
We're going to explore what these sources are telling us about what poverty in the United States really is, why it's so persistent.
And pull out the key insights, maybe the surprising facts, too.
Exactly. The important stuff.
And one of those surprising facts, it just hits you right away in this material. The picture of U.S. poverty compared to other wealthy nations. It's pretty stark.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
These sources highlight, for example, there's a study from the mid-1990s looking at 19 rich nations
Okay.
in the United States. It had the highest rate of poverty in that group, more than twice the average of those other countries.
Wow, twice the average. That's a lot. And I saw another study from around 2000 using what they call a relative poverty line.
Right, 50% of the median income.
Yeah. So using that, the U.S. rate was 17%, which is, quite a bit higher than the U.K. at 12.3% or Canada at 11.9%.
And it's not just that more people are poor here, statistically speaking. The sources really emphasize that the poor in the United States are often worse off, in absolute terms, than the poor in most other industrialized nations.
Worse off how?
Well, one analysis just flatly states it. The American poor are really poor. They face genuine deprivation, serious hardship, not just, having less than others.
Really poor. That phrase, it sticks with you. And it
Uh-huh.
sounds like poverty here isn't just widespread, it's also getting, deeper for
Yeah.
those experiencing it.
That's another key finding from these sources, yeah. They talk about the poverty gap.
Which
It's
is,
basically how far below the poverty line the average poor family's income falls. And this gap, it's actually increased significantly since the early 1970s.
wait, hold on. So even during times when the economy was supposedly booming, growing,
Hmm.
the poor were actually falling further behind.
Precisely. That's what the data shows. The sources mentioned the income deficit for families in poverty was $7,732 and $2,000.
Okay.
And by 2005, it had grown to $8,125.
Mm.
So the severity, the actual depth of poverty intensified.
Okay, so we've got high poverty rates compared to similar countries. The poor here are often worse off, and the depth of that poverty is increasing.
Hmm.
Which leads us, I guess, to the huge question these sources are grappling with. Why?
Right.
In a country as wealthy as the United States, why is there so much poverty?
And these sources, they really dig into the different explanations you hear, but they ultimately focus pretty heavily on one area in particular.
You often hear the individualistic view, right? Like
Yeah.
it's all down to personal factors.
Right. That perspective, sometimes it gets associated with critiques of works like the bell curve, which some of the sources discuss. It tends to see poverty as purely a personal problem, caused by individual inferiority, maybe bad choices, maybe low IQ. It frames poverty more as a kind of social behavior rather than a condition embedded in society itself.
But the sources you shared seem to push back pretty strongly against that being the main explanation.
They do. Their critique is pretty clear.
Hmm.
This view just completely fails to explain why poverty exists on such a large scale,
Yeah.
in the aggregate,
Right.
or why it's so widespread, or why the gap between rich and poor is so vast and, importantly, growing. Things like genetics, for instance. They don't dictate that millions of people working full-time jobs earn less than a living wage.
Okay. So it's not just about individual shortcomings. What about the culture of poverty idea? You hear that sometimes.
That's another perspective the sources explore. And it's interesting. It originally came from thinkers like Michael Harrington and Oscar Lewis. And they initially saw the culture of poverty they observed as more of a symptom of deeper economic and political problems.
Yeah.
How persistent poverty over generations can shape behaviors and outlooks.
Okay. But that idea got twisted, maybe.
Yeah, it was later adapted, especially by conservatives who kind of flipped it around. They argued the culture itself was the cause of poverty.
I see.
And this version focused on things like, say, welfare dependency, or claimed destructive and pathological patterns of behavior, sometimes targeting specific groups like African Americans. It really became a way to shift the blame back onto individuals and their supposed behaviors.
Which sounds, again, a lot like blaming the victim.
It absolutely could be used that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And the sources you provided offer a pretty strong critique of that conservative version.
How so?
Well, they point out that the vast majority of people experiencing poverty are incredibly diverse. They're not fundamentally different from the rest of society. Most don't fit that negative stereotype, you know, lazy, irresponsible part of some deviant subculture.
Right.
That culture of poverty theory, when used like that, really only describes a very, very small segment, sometimes called the underclass.
So it can't be a general explanation for widespread poverty.
Exactly. It just doesn't hold up as a general theory for why millions are poor.
Okay, so if it's not primarily individual failings, and it's not really a separate culture causing it,
Yeah.
what do these sources argue is the main driver? Why so much poverty in the U.S.?
They overwhelmingly emphasize the structural perspective,
Structural.
meaning
Ah.
poverty is seen as a fundamental social problem. It's a direct byproduct of how power is distributed in society and how our society is, well, organized.
Huh.
It stems from these bigger economic, political, cultural, and social forces that are largely outside of any single individual's control.
Like the economy not producing enough jobs that pay a decent wage? Is that the kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly like that. Or corporate strategies designed to keep wages down. Or a political system that seems to mainly serve the interests of the wealthy. Or media narratives that keep reinforcing individual blame. Or persistent discrimination and segregation. From this viewpoint, poverty isn't some weird anomaly. It's actually kind of built into the system itself.
Okay, right. Let's really dive into these structural causes then, starting with the economic system. These sources point out something really interesting. The link between economic growth and poverty reduction seems to have broken down since the 80s. A rising tide isn't lifting all boats anymore.
That breakdown is absolutely central to the structural argument, and it's happening in large part because of rapidly increasing earnings inequality.
Meaning the rich are getting richer faster.
Much faster. The sources show the rich are capturing a vastly larger share of the economic pie.
Can you give us a couple of the most striking numbers on that from the sources?
Sure. One key statistic they mention is the share of national income going just to the top 1%.
Yep.
It rose from 8% in 1970 to 15% by 1998. Just think about that jump, almost double the share, going to that tiny sliver at the top.
Wow.
And here's another one that's just incredible. In 2005, the total income of the top 300,000 Americans was nearly equal to the income of the bottom 150 million Americans.
Whoa, wait. Say that again? The top 300,000?
Yep. Made almost as much as the entire bottom half of the country.
That's a staggering level of concentration.
It really highlights the source's point, doesn't it? That the gains from wealth creation, from productivity increases, they're being increasingly monopolized right at the very top.
Which makes it incredibly hard for people at the lower end to get ahead, even through work.
Exactly. To achieve stability through work alone becomes much, much harder.
And the types of jobs available have changed dramatically too, right? That's part of this.
Absolutely. That whole shift from manufacturing,
Yeah.
which, often provided better wages, benefits, less inequality.
Right, this sort of classic middle-class job.
Exactly. That shift towards a service-based economy has created a much larger pool of lower-wage jobs, often with greater inequality baked in.
Like that example in the sources, the worker laid off from the Hoover factory.
Exactly. That really illustrates it. A 55-year-old guy making $50,000 a year, stable manufacturing job for decades,
Yeah.
suddenly finds himself facing the reality of maybe working at Walmart for $7.50 an hour. That massive transformation in the labor market is a huge driver of low-wage work.
And globalization, how does that fit into this economic picture?
It plays a big role, too. Increased global competition puts downward pressure on wages here.
Not just in factory jobs that can be outsourced.
No, not just those. Even in service jobs that aren't directly exposed to foreign competition, because there's often an oversupply, like a glut, of job candidates competing for those limited positions.
Yeah.
It suppresses wages across the board.
There's also this really important point the sources make about productivity versus pay. I found this fascinating.
This is absolutely critical. For decades now, worker pay has lagged way behind productivity growth.
So workers are producing more stuff more efficiently.
More value than ever
Yeah.
before, yeah. But they're just not seeing that translate into their paychecks.
So that link, that connection between the average worker and the wealth they're helping create, that's been broken.
Essentially, yes. The sources show that from 1966 to 2001, only the very top 10% of Americans saw their earnings actually keep pace with productivity growth.
Only the top 10%.
Yep. Everyone else fell behind.
We often hear that the earnings gap between college graduates and those with less education is because of a skills gap. College grads are doing great because they have the right skills for the modern economy. What do these sources say about that narrative?
They offer a much more, well, nuanced explanation. They say while the gap has widened, sure,
Okay.
it's not primarily because college grads are just skyrocketing ahead financially. It's largely because the earnings of high school graduates have actually declined significantly.
Declined, not just stagnated.
Declined by 20% between 1979 and 1994. During that same period, college graduates' earnings only increased by about 5%.
Wow. So the big story isn't just the top pulling away, it's the bottom falling back.
Exactly. The bottom doing much, much worse financially. That's a huge part of the widening gap.
So why is that happening? Why are less educated workers seeing their wages fall so dramatically? Is it just technology making skills obsolete?
The sources argue, no, it's not simply technology. They point squarely at structural factors hitting these workers really hard.
Such as?
Things like the real value of the minimum wage falling dramatically over time, heightened foreign competition, like we mentioned, and crucially, the sharp decline of unions, which used to provide significant bargaining power for these workers.
And college grads, they have other ways to protect their earnings.
Exactly. College graduates, especially in certain professions like law or medicine, they often use institutional barriers, big licensing requirements, credentials, to protect their earnings in ways that non-college workers simply can't access. So the sources argue the struggle for less educated workers isn't just a deficit of skills. It's more a deficit of institutional support and, crucially, bargaining power compared to those at the top.
That paints a very different picture. It's not necessarily that people can't find any work. It's that the work available often doesn't pay enough.
Right.
And the system doesn't give them the tools, the leverage to demand more.
Precisely. And this leads directly to what the sources call a shortage of adequate jobs.
Adequate jobs, okay.
Yeah, they use this concept of subemployment, which is broader than just the official unemployment rate you usually hear about.
How is it broader? What does it include?
Well, it includes people who are officially unemployed, sure,
Right.
but also those who've given up looking for work, the discouraged workers.
Right.
Also people working part-time, but who really want and need full-time work. And very importantly, people working full-time, but still earning poverty-level wages.
So even if the official unemployment number looks, okay-ish, the real picture on the ground is much worse.
Much, much worse, according to this measure. Using the official poverty line back in the late 90s, the sources found a subemployment rate of nearly 23%, almost 1 in 4 workers.
23%? That's huge.
It affected nearly 33 million workers then.
Wow.
And if you use a slightly more realistic standard, like 150% of the poverty line, which is still very low income,
Yeah.
over 50 million people were subemployed. This isn't about individual work ethic, the sources stress. This is a massive structural problem of just too few jobs that actually provide basic economic security.
Okay, so the economic system growing inequality, the changing job landscape, stagnant wages for most, not enough adequate jobs, that's a huge piece of the puzzle. What about the political system? The sources claim the U.S. government is, way less effective at reducing poverty compared to other rich countries.
That's another really striking finding highlighted early on.
How much less effective?
Well, the sources show that governments in, say, the average developed countries, they use their tax and spending policies to reduce poverty rates dramatically. On average, from about 26% before those government interventions down to under 10% after.
Wow, that's a big drop.
Huge drop. The U.S., by contrast, we only managed to lower the rate from about 24% down to 17%.
So much less impact.
Much less. And the difference is even bigger, even more stark. When you look specifically at families with children, our government just doesn't do nearly as much to counteract poverty as its peers do.
So why? Why is the U.S. system less effective in that way?
The sources point to the fundamental design of the U.S. political system itself. They argue it's inherently resistant to policies that would, redistribute wealth or power towards the working class and the poor.
How so? What parts of the system?
Well, one factor they discuss is our winner-take-all electoral system.
How does that contribute to poverty? I mean, isn't that just how we elect people?
Think about it this way. If you vote for a candidate who gets, say, 49% of the vote in your district,
Yeah.
all those millions of people who voted for them get zero representation in that particular seat. The winner takes all the representation.
Okay, right.
This system tends to underrepresent minority constituencies, politically speaking, not just racially, which often includes the working class and poor. It leaves large chunks of the electorate feeling like their vote doesn't really translate into political power or influence on policy. It violates, they argue, the principle of fair representation.
And what about checks and balances? We're always taught that's a good thing, prevents tyranny.
And it does have that function.
Hmm.
But the sources argue it also creates what they call an unlevel legislative playing field when it comes to challenging powerful, entrenched interests.
Unlevel how?
Well, wealthy campaign contributors, powerful corporations, well-organized business lobbyists, they have numerous access points and, critically, veto points within our fragmented system.
Ah, places they can stop things.
Exactly. They can block or water down reforms they don't like much more easily than less powerful groups can push reforms through. It's fundamentally easier for powerful groups to stop change than for less powerful groups to make change happen in this system.
And federalism. The division of power between the federal government and the states. How does that play in?
The sources call out what they term the privileged position it gives to business.
Privileged position.
Yeah. States and cities are constantly competing with each other to attract or just keep businesses within their borders.
Right, the whole race to the bottom sometime.
Kind of. This gives corporations huge leverage. They can demand favorable tax breaks, subsidies, weaker environmental or labor regulations by threatening to pack up and move elsewhere.
And that pressure often pushes state and local governments away from policies that might help workers or fund social programs?
Often, yes. It creates a dynamic where business interests frequently outweigh the needs of workers or the poor in state and local policymaking.
It really sounds like, based on these sources, there's been a significant shift in political power over time.
The sources argue exactly that. They say there's been a major conscious shift towards greater business power, especially since the 1970s.
Why then?
Well, as businesses faced new challenges, more global competition, declining profits, rising social movements demanding change, they responded with what the sources call a well-financed and multifaceted counteroffensive to influence politics and public policy much more directly.
And they also talk about a change in American civic life, like how people participate.
Yes, what they term a civic transformation.
Yeah.
There's been a noticeable decline in traditional membership organizations.
Like unions, community groups.
Exactly. Unions, community groups, veterans groups, organizations that were often grassroots, engaged less privileged people directly and kind of fostered democracy from the bottom up.
And what replaced them?
They've been increasingly replaced by advocacy organizations. These are often more top-down, run by professional staff, focused heavily on lobbying, fundraising, media campaigns.
Okay.
And they often reflect the interests and priorities of, frankly, upper-middle-class constituencies more than working-class ones. This shift, the sources argue, reduces the overall capacity for organized action focused on things like redistributive goals or broad economic justice.
So, okay. The system itself is resistant to egalitarian change. Political power has shifted more towards business interests, and the types of organizations advocating for the poor and working class have declined. On top of all that, the sources say specific government policies have actually weakened the safety net.
That's another critical piece of the political argument, yes. The sources highlight how the safety net itself has been actively weakened over time.
Like unemployment insurance.
Yeah, unemployment insurance, for instance. It's often difficult for many workers to even qualify for it. The rules can be outdated, the benefits are often insufficient compared to other countries, and it leaves many, many workers completely unprotected, especially low-wage or gig workers.
And the big welfare reforms of the 1990s. NEANF.
Right, the 1996 reforms, TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which replaced the older AFDC program.
Yeah, I remember that.
These reforms impose strict time limits on receiving cash assistance, mandatory work requirements, and pretty harsh sanctions for not meeting rules.
And the impact.
The sources argue this severely reduced access to basic cash assistance for many extremely poor families, even when their need grew. It made life significantly harder and more precarious for many low-income households, especially single mothers.
And what about unions? Traditionally, they were a major force for workers' rights, better pay.
The sources describe what amounts to a sustained assault on unions and workers' rights.
Assault. That sounds strong.
It reflects the sources' analysis. They note it's not that workers don't want union surveys consistently show a majority. Over 50% say they would join one if they could.
So why aren't they?
Because the environment is incredibly hostile. Employers use aggressive, sometimes illegal strategies to prevent organizing. And the sources argue that government agencies, the courts, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board have frequently sided with employers, creating what one source calls a culture of impunity.
Impunity meaning employers can break the rules to stop unions without facing serious consequences.
Effectively, yes. That's the argument. Plus, Laws themselves permit actions like permanently replacing workers who go on strike, which severely undermines workers' fundamental power to bargain collectively.
So the government isn't neutral.
The sources conclude that the government, through both policy and enforcement, or lack thereof, has effectively lined up against working Americans in many instances.
Okay, so putting that whole political picture together, a system resistant to reform benefiting the less powerful, a big power shift towards business, the political marginalization of the poor, a weakened safety net, policies actively suppressing worker power. It seems to explain a huge amount about why poverty and inequality persists so strongly in the U.S., even when the economy grows overall.
That's right.
The poor and working class just don't seem to have equitable access to the political tools they'd need to significantly improve their situation through policy.
That is the central argument these sources are making regarding the political dimension of poverty in America. It's deeply intertwined with how power operates.
Shifting gears just slightly, how does the cultural system, how poverty is understood, talked about in society, in the media, how does that play into this larger structural picture?
Well, the sources definitely discuss the media's significant influence in shaping how the public understands poverty.
But they're critical of it.
They argue that mainstream media coverage often falls short. It rarely provides really serious analysis of the structural causes we've been talking about.
So what does it do instead?
Instead, it tends to reinforce that dominant individualistic ideology we discussed earlier.
How? By focusing on individual stories, like rags to riches or maybe just hard luck stories.
Exactly. They often use what are called personalized story frames. These highlight individual circumstances, personal struggles, maybe someone overcoming odds, maybe someone failing.
And the effect is,
The implicit suggestion is often that poverty is mainly a result of personal choices, individual effort, or lack thereof. Or maybe just bad luck, rather than a systemic issue rooted in how society is set up. It subtly reinforces the idea that it's not really society's problem to solve structurally.
and the media itself, it's often run like a business, right? Does that
Yeah,
play a role?
precisely. The sources point out that corporate ownership and the relentless pressure for profit mean the bottom line prevails.
Less money for deep reporting.
Right. Less investment in the kind of in-depth investigative reporting that would be needed to really explore complex structural issues. It's cheaper and easier to do those personalized stories.
And there's been external pressure on media coverage, too.
Yes, the sources point to a pretty effective effort, particularly from conservative groups since the 1970s, watchdog organizations, pressure campaigns.
What was their goal?
They successfully pushed media outlets towards what was framed as neutrality, which often meant shying away from structural analyses, frequently by labeling any such reporting as having a liberal bias.
Okay, so the media and broader cultural narratives tend to keep the focus locked on individuals, kind of distracting from the bigger systemic problems.
Got it. Finally, let's look at the social systems, things like group memberships, neighborhoods, social networks. How do these structural factors contribute to poverty?
Right, this is about social location. The sources show that which groups you belong to based on things like gender, race, ethnicity, immigration status significantly impacts your economic outcomes.
How?
Due to factors like social status, prestige, historical prejudice, ongoing discrimination. Privilege often flows automatically to dominant groups, say, traditionally, white males in the U.S. context, while less privileged groups face all sorts of built-in obstacles.
Is this where that idea of durable inequality comes in? I saw that term.
Yes, exactly. That's a term one of the sources uses. It's the idea that dominant groups actively work, consciously or not, to exploit opportunities and then hoard them, passing advantages down across generations, making inequality persistent or durable.
And neighborhoods are a huge factor here too, right?
Yeah.
Where you live matters enormously. Oh, critically important. Residential segregation by class and by race concentrates disadvantage geographically.
How does that work?
Well, high-poverty neighborhoods, often ghettos or barrios, tend to mean poor quality schools, more exposure to environmental hazards, less access to healthy food or good services, higher crime rates, all for the residents who are disproportionately poor and often minorities.
And the flip side.
Conversely, more privileged, affluent neighborhoods confer all sorts of benefits on their residents. Better schools, safer streets, more amenities, better access to influential networks. So where you live profoundly shapes your life chances from the very beginning.
So your geographic location itself becomes a kind of structural disadvantage or advantage. And what about social networks? The who you know factor.
This is another key structural factor the sources really highlight. Who you know can often be more important than what you know, meaning your actual skills, your education, what economists sometimes call your human capital.
Why is who you know so powerful?
Because networks, personal connections, they provide access to information, especially about jobs and opportunities that might not even be publicly advertised.
Right.
But if you live in a segregated low-income neighborhood, your social networks might be more resource poor. They might be less connected to job opportunities in growing sectors of the economy or in different parts of the city or regions.
The sources gave an example, didn't they, about trade school graduates?
Yeah, that was a powerful one. Black men graduating from a trade school, they had the technical skills, the human capital,
Mm-hmm.
but they often lacked access to the informal, predominantly white networks that helped white graduates from the very same school get into the better-paying, more stable jobs in the trades.
So the unequal distribution of these connections, this social capital, as they call it, really contributes to unequal outcomes, even among people with similar skills.
It absolutely does. Social connections can determine whether you hear about a good job or only a bad one, whether you get a foot in the door, whether you can move up or just stay stuck. The social system, through your group membership, your neighborhood, your networks, heavily influences who is likely to fall into poverty or struggle to get out.
But the sources make a really crucial distinction here at the end of the section, don't they? About what determines who ends up poor versus what determines why poverty exists in the first place at the scale it does.
Yes, that's a critical takeaway. The sources conclude that while your social location, your group, your neighborhood, your network helps determine who is most susceptible to poverty.
Right. It sorts people.
It sorts people, exactly.
Hmm.
But the fundamental existence of poverty and its extent why we have so much of it, those are primarily problems of the political economy,
Meaning?
meaning they stem mainly from the lack of quality jobs available in the economic system, the suppression of wages, and government policies that fail to adequately support workers and the poor, or in some cases, even actively work against their interests.
So just to sum that part up, the economic and political systems are what create the high rate and the depth of poverty we see.
That's the argument.
And then the social system, race, class, neighborhood, networks, largely determines which specific groups and individuals are most likely to experience that poverty.
That's the core structural argument presented across these sources, yes.
Okay. Beyond these big systemic forces, economic, political, social, cultural assertions, the sources also detail some very specific, concrete, structural obstacles, things that make it incredibly hard for individuals to escape poverty no matter how hard they try, right?
Exactly. These are the daily realities, the practical barriers that people run up against constantly.
Yeah.
Discrimination is a huge one, with very real economic consequences.
And the sources provide clear evidence of this, not just anecdotes.
Oh yeah, they cite some really compelling field experiments, audit studies, basically.
Like the one about job applicants?
Exactly. The one that found that equally qualified black men without any criminal record had no better chance of getting a callback after submitting a job application than equally qualified white men with criminal records.
That's a stunning finding about the real-world impact of racial bias in hiring.
It really is, and it shows directly how discrimination acts as a structural barrier. It leads to unequal access to jobs, longer periods of unemployment for minorities, segregation into lower-paying occupations, and ultimately, lower lifetime earnings. It's built right into hiring practices, consciously or unconsciously.
Housing is another major obstacle the sources highlight, calling it a crisis.
Absolutely. A housing crisis, particularly for low-income families. Millions face what they call excessive cost burdens.
Meaning they spend too much of their income on rent or mortgage.
Way too much. Often over 30%, sometimes even over 50% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. For renters in the bottom quarter of income earners, one source noted a record 46% were spending over half their income on housing back in 2004.
Half their income, which leaves almost nothing for food, healthcare, transportation, childcare, anything else.
Exactly. And beyond just the severe cost burdens, the sources also mention issues like living in substandard housing places with safety issues, lack of basic amenities, or the risks tied to homeownership for the poor involving predatory loans, unsustainable payments, and the constant threat of foreclosure. And like we discussed, residential segregation just piles all these housing hardships onto specific neighborhoods, concentrating the problem.
Okay, what about education? We often hear that education is the main path out of poverty, but the sources seem skeptical.
Well, they highlight that the education system itself in the U.S. is characterized by deep inequality and segregation. It's not an equal playing field.
How so?
Affluent, mostly white children are often concentrated in well-funded, effectively segregated schools, offering lots of resources and opportunities.
Oh,
While low-income children and minority children are disproportionately concentrated in high poverty, often chronically underfunded schools. Or they get steered into less challenging academic tracks within schools.
this sounds like what one source called a syndrome of inequalities.
That's the term they used, yeah. It's a compounding of disadvantages right within the school system. This environment fundamentally undermines educational achievement for poor kids and limits their life chances right from the start. It denies genuine equal opportunity structurally.
Transportation is another barrier that might not be obvious to everyone, but the sources say it's crucial.
It's presented as a really major obstacle, yeah. Sometimes even more significant than childcare when it comes to accessing job training or just keeping a job consistently.
How does it limit people?
Lack of reliable, affordable transportation, whether it's owning a dependable car or having access to good public transit, severely limits access to jobs, especially those located outside their immediate neighborhood, which is common.
Right, jobs often move to the suburbs.
Exactly. It also limits access to essential services like healthcare, grocery stores with fresh food, banks, and even enriching activities like libraries or parks for their kids.
And it's expensive too, I imagine.
Oh, hugely expensive. For low-income families who do own cars, transportation can eat up between 1/4 and 1/3 of their entire income, according to these sources. That's a massive chunk.
Speaking of massive expenses, childcare. That's mentioned as a huge struggle, particularly for single mothers.
Childcare is incredibly expensive in the U.S. The sources note it often costs more than public college tuition or even rent in many states.
More than college tuition? Wow.
Yeah, it's a massive budget strain and a constant logistical nightmare for poor families. Finding care that is affordable, available when you need it, especially for non-standard work hours and high quality, it's a huge challenge.
And getting government help, subsidies, that's complicated too.
Yes, navigating the subsidy systems is often complex, bureaucratic, and the funding is just grossly insufficient to meet the need.
How insufficient?
The sources note that only about 1 in 7 eligible families actually receive any child care assistance. 1 in 7. Leaving the vast majority to somehow scrape by, rely on often unstable informal care, or make impossible choices.
Which can then trap them in poverty, right? How?
Exactly. Lack of affordable, reliable childcare directly limits parents, usually mothers' ability to work consistent hours or take better jobs. It reduces their earnings potential. It causes job instability. You miss work because care falls through. Maybe you get fired. It can literally trap parents in low-wage work and poverty. And critically, it also impacts the children by limiting their access to quality early childhood education, which can perpetuate poverty into the next generation.
It's a vicious cycle.
Health is also discussed, and the sources make a really strong point about the direction of the relationship between poverty and health. It's not what you might assume.
Yeah, they argue very forcefully that poverty fundamentally causes ill health, much more than ill health causes poverty, although that can happen too.
How does poverty cause ill health? Several ways. Poor people face constant chronic stress from economic insecurity, which takes a physical toll. They're more likely to live in environments with more hazards, pollution, poor housing. They often lack the resources for healthy food, safe places for recreation, preventative health care.
And their jobs.
And the low-wage jobs they often hold are themselves unhealthy. They frequently lack health insurance or paid sick leave. They tend to be insecure, sometimes exploitative or demeaning, maybe physically dangerous. Crucially, they often lack worker control or autonomy.
So it's not just that sick people might become poor, it's that the very conditions of being poor actively make you sick.
That's the powerful link the sources emphasize. The lack of control, the lack of autonomy, the lack of freedom that is inherent in poverty creates chronic stress. And that stress is a major biological driver of poor health outcomes, heart disease, diabetes, mental health issues, you name it.
So fixing health disparities requires fixing poverty.
The sources conclude that making significant progress on the huge health disparities faced by disadvantaged groups really requires addressing the underlying economic and political inequalities that create and sustain their poverty in the first place.
Finally, retirement insecurity. That's brought up as another structural barrier facing the poor long term.
Yeah, the sources look at retirement security as traditionally resting on a three-legged stool.
Okay, what are the legs?
Social Security, personal savings, and employer-sponsored pensions. But for the poor, this stool's incredibly shaky, maybe missing legs entirely.
How so?
Well, low lifetime earnings mean lower Social Security benefits, even though SS is progressive. They typically have almost no personal savings. How could they? And crucially, very few low-wage workers have access to employer-sponsored pensions or retirement plans like 401ks.
So that third leg, the private pension leg, is often just missing.
Precisely. One source cited data from 2004 showing only about 19% of workers in the bottom income quartile had any kind of pension coverage through their job,
19% compared to.
compared to over 64% of workers in the top income quartile. It's a massive gap. So many future low-wage retirees face old age without that crucial third leg of retirement income, leaving them incredibly vulnerable.
Wow. Okay. That is a lot to take in.
Huh.
We've covered a huge range of really interconnected issues here. We went from those initial surprising facts about just the rate and the depth of U.S. poverty compared to other places, through the critiques of blaming individuals or their supposed culture,
Right.
to the overwhelming evidence presented in these sources pointing towards structural causes, the economic system driving inequality and inadequate jobs, the political system resistant to reform and influenced by money, the cultural narratives that often obscure those structures, and the social system that sorts people into positions of advantage or disadvantage.
Yeah, the big picture system.
And then we detailed all those specific concrete structural obstacles, discrimination, the housing crisis, unequal education, transportation barriers, the crushing cost of childcare, the way poverty drives poor health, and finally, retirement insecurity.
It's comprehensive. And the core argument running through all of it from these sources is very clear and very consistent. Poverty in America is not primarily a result of individual failings or some separate culture of the poor.
Right.
It is fundamentally a problem created and perpetuated by the way our economic, political, and social systems are currently organized, and it's reinforced by dominant cultural narratives. It is, as they state pretty clearly, primarily a problem of political economy.
And understanding it that way, really seeing it as a structural problem rather than just a collection of personal problems that completely changes how you have to think about solutions, doesn't it?
It absolutely has to. If poverty is fundamentally structural, then purely individual-level interventions, while they might be helpful for some specific people, sure, they're just not going to solve the problem at its root or on the massive scale required.
So addressing structural poverty requires structural systemic change.
That's the logical conclusion, yes.
Now, these sources mention, kind of circling back to the political dimension, that the working class and the poor are often politically and economically marginalized, which helps explain, why the system stays the way it is.
Right, that lack of power is key.
But they also suggest, maybe tentatively, that collective action, social movements, particularly something they refer to as social movement unionism, might offer a potential pathway. A way for these marginalized groups to build power and actually push for change against that imbalanced structure.
Yes, they do end by pointing towards that possibility. The idea that overcoming these deep-seated structural obstacles might ultimately depend on the ability of the working class and the poor themselves to organize effectively, to build collective power, and to directly challenge the existing distribution of resources and political influence.
So here's maybe the provocative thought these sources kind of leave us grappling with. Does the ability to significantly reduce structural poverty in America ultimately depend less on specific policies and more on the ability of marginalized groups, the working class, the poor, to build enough power to actually reshape the rules of the game? What would it actually take, realistically, to see that kind of power shift back towards working Americans?